The room smelled of antiseptic and crayons. A small hospital lamp threw a soft pool of light over a bed where a child lay, surrounded by torn blankets, a threadbare stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, and a scattering of drawing pencils in a plastic cup. Monitors hummed like a distant tide. Outside, rain tapped on the window. Inside, the world was measured in breaths and the slow, steady checking of a nurse's pen against a chart. Maya Torres was 8. She had the blunt honesty of children who have learned a lot in too little time. Her hair was braided into 2 uneven plaits. She liked to ask for orange popsicles even when she didn't need them. She carried small rituals, arranging her pencils by color, pressing her thumb into the worn patch on her rabbit's belly, and whispering a secret she called "my brave thought." That afternoon, she asked for something different. "I want to meet Justin," she said, as if stating the time of day. Claire, her mother, laughed at first, not from humor so much as disbelief. They had made lists of impossible things before. They had scribbled fantasies into the margins of pain. Theme parks had been suggested, a day at the beach, a chance to see a circus. Claire had learned to say yes to simple truths and let hope do the rest. "You mean Justin Bieber?" she asked, tracing the inside of Maya's hand with her thumb. Maya nodded. "I like his voice. I like when he sings about being brave. He made me promise I'd keep trying." The plea was small and precise. Not for charity or fame, not a public stunt or a donation. Just a meeting. Claire sat at a tiny hospital desk that had seen 100 frantic scribbles of sorrow and love, and she typed with fingers that trembled in ways she tried to hide. She posted one short note on a neighborhood page and then on a fan forum, on a local mothers group, and on a plea page for wish-granting organizations. It could have been swallowed by the noise of the internet. It could have been just one more line in a river of asks. Instead, it floated off like a message in a bottle. Within hours, a kind of quiet attention found it. A retired postal carrier in a small coastal town named Sam Hargrove, who had once delivered packages to a woman who worked on music tours, shared the post with a friend. The friend, who still knew people who move in music circles, forwarded it with a single line: "Read this, please." From there, it passed hands and phones the way family recipes pass between generations, softly, insistently, until finally it landed on a screen that mattered. The man who read it did not act like a headline. He sat back in a chair, the late sun catching the edge of a framed photograph on his mantel. He had seen a lot. He had learned to say less and to let the small things decide their own weight. Behind him, a manager named Evan frowned and opened a folder labeled Private. Security checked calendars and schedules. Someone typed the hospital's number into a phone and listened to the polite, practiced voice of an administrator. The plan that formed was deliberate only in its desire for privacy. No cameras, no press, no spectacle. A small team, a quiet car, a request for a closed room, and a blanket to keep the light steady. They called the hospital administrator and asked for discretion. The administrator, a woman named Harper, had seen many requests in her life, some flashy, some foolish. She had also stood beside beds where ordinary kindness had changed endings. She promised privacy and sent a nurse to stand by, soft voice ready, clipboard set aside. The arrival was measured. A black SUV rolled up at dusk, low and anonymous. 2 aides in plain jackets helped a man through the sliding doors. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and a hoodie that read like any young man in a city, untethered, unassuming. A manager and a security professional followed, their presence small as shadow. They moved with the discipline of people who had learned to guard more than physical space. They guarded a moment. Inside, the room flashed with the ordinary. The sound of a monitor, the smell of lemon cleanser, the small, insistent beeping that punctuated conversation. The aides set down a small bag near the chair. The man removed his cap. He sat with the kind of care that knows how to be quiet. He did not ask for photos. He did not introduce himself with a title. He was just another person in a room full of waiting. "Hi, Maya," he said, voice low as a promise. Maya's eyes were at first half closed, the way a child keeps one foot in sleep even when the rest of the world wakes. Then something like recognition stirred. It wasn't the face she knew from screens. It was the timbre of the voice, the slope of a laugh that felt familiar because she had memorized it from songs. She turned her head slowly. "You're Justin," she whispered. The name fell like a small lamp switching on inside a dark house. There was no shout, no sudden fanfare, only a child's clear certainty and the way it carved the room into two parts, before and after. Claire's hands moved like a reflex to her mouth. Nurses gathered at the edge of the doorway, professional faces softened. The manager looked away as if to grant the family intimacy. The security guard, who had been trained to hold boundaries, let his jaw slacken with the same human astonishment as everyone else. The anonymity was gone, not in a scandalous unmasking, but in an honest, tender recognition. Justin leaned forward, not surprised and not the least bit performative. "Hey," he said, and there was a softness to the sound that had nothing to do with cameras or applause. "Maya, it's really nice to meet you. Thank you for asking." They spoke in fragments, about favorite colors, about the rabbit and how a missing ear made it more interesting. He hummed a little melody, careful with the tune, so it wouldn't unsettle the monitors. Maya smiled in a way that made the corners of her eyes bright. She told him about her brave thought. He listened as if it were the most important thing he had heard that day. He did not promise miracles. He promised small, concrete things. He produced from his bag a worn scrapbook of ticket stubs and photos and, tucked carefully, a small pin shaped like a paper plane. A private keepsake, not for publicity, but as a token of a conversation. He signed the inside cover of one of Maya's coloring books with a Sharpie stroke that he later asked should be written lightly. "For Maya, keep flying," he wrote, and his handwriting trembled in the moment like everyone else's. There was a plan they had discussed before he came. He had told his team he wanted to give Maya something she could hold on to, a memory that would feel like a bright day. A short, private flight in a small plane, just the two of them and a pilot who would let Maya look out at the world like a bird. They arranged the details in whispers. Permission forms signed by Claire, a pilot reserved for an hour, a small airfield an hour's drive away with a single red biplane kept under a tarpaulin. Before the flight could happen, there was a small mosaic of ordinary miracles. Volunteers from the community found a way to provide a van with reclining seats. A retired pilot named Commander Lane dusted off his logbooks and sent a note, "I'll fly her." The hospital social worker found an insurance liaison to sign off on a bedside-to-airfield transfer. People who had nothing to gain gave their time and expertise as if magnetized by a single pure wish. If you had watched the world from above in those hours, you would have seen small hands at work. You would have seen neighbors knitting blankets, a local bakery sending cupcakes that no one expected to be eaten, and a handful of messages from people who wrote, "I saw the post, happy to help." The internet, in this case, behaved like a neighborhood. It gathered. After the flight was planned, Justin stayed. He sat on the chair near the bed and read aloud from a children's book until Maya corrected the rhythm of his sentences. They swapped stories that had nothing to do with fame, about favorite breakfasts, about the small things that make mornings stick. When it was time to go, they walked slowly to the car. Cameras of the outside world were kept at bay. The journey to the airfield unfolded in a kind of hush, the car's windows fogging slightly with breath and rain. The biplane waited beneath the low clouds, its bright red wings a small defiant color against a gray sky. Maya climbed into the cockpit with the steady hands of someone who has learned to trust other people's care. She gripped the strap of her rabbit. Justin sat beside her, sleeves rolled up, not a star in a spotlight, but a companion in a cramped plane with oil-stained pedals and an honest engine. They took off. And for 20 minutes, the world became something that happened under a small pair of wings. Maya waved one small hand at the patchwork of towns and fields. She laughed when the wind threw her hair. Justin kept saying things like, "Look at that," as if he himself was seeing something new. He recorded a voice memo of her laughter because he wanted to keep the sound. They spiraled, dipped, and flew low enough that farmhouses looked like models and dogs looked like flecks of fur. When they landed, Maya had a new kind of light in her eyes. It was precise and innocent, joy compacted into a bright particle. The airport's tarmac smelled of oil and sun-warmed metal. Volunteers wrapped her in a borrowed jacket. There were no cameras waiting, no viral crew. Just people who would come to be part of one small, curated day. Weeks passed and seasons shifted in the slow clock of illness. The flight became a memory stitched into a life of hospital corridors and quiet afternoons. Friends and strangers who had watched the small story shared messages of kindness. The scrapbooks filled up. There were days when Maya was stronger and days when the machines did their measuring in tiny, necessary alerts. One late evening, when twilight had thinned into a long, cool blue, Maya's breathing changed. Claire sat up all night beside her, holding the rabbit's ear and talking as if conversation itself could tether the world. The hospital staff were gentle and exacting, professionals who had learned how to hold both life and grief without letting one drown the other. Maya's last conversation was small. She said, "Thanks," with an economy that was all child and all adult, an expression that felt like both apology and benediction. She pressed her thumb into the rabbit's belly once more. Claire stroked her hair and felt the last of the day's warmth, as if love could be measured in the degree of a forehead's heat. When she was gone, the hush in the room was thicker than any silence Claire had known. The people who had been there, the nurse who had sung low hymns, the flight crew who had dried their eyes, Justin, who had returned the night before and sat on the far side of the room, held themselves still. He did not speak at length. He left a note folded in a small envelope that Claire later found in his handwriting, "For Maya, who taught me how to keep trying." He left a small bank transfer recorded in a private ledger, an amount pledged to seed something modest and tangible, not publicity, but the start of a communal fund to grant last wishes like Maya's. The details of that pledge were to be handled discreetly, through a private foundation and with community partners. An on-screen card later noted that the specifics of that fund were subject to verification and that certain elements of this story had been dramatized in service of narrative. Grief, oddly, became a kind of engine. The private pledge, modest and sincere, struck a chord. People who had seen Maya's story, neighbors, strangers on a fan forum, people who had been moved by the quiet way one life had been honored, began to act. Donations came in from small accounts and a few larger ones. Local businesses offered to match funds. Volunteers organized drives to create days like Maya's for other children. The initiative that grew was not built in one night, but in 1,000 small acts. Pilots offering an hour, musicians volunteering a private song, bakers sending cupcakes, drivers offering their vans. This undertaking never wore the badge of officialdom. It was not presented as a governmental program or a corporate mandate. It was a private fund and a patchwork of goodwill, simple, nimble, and attentive to the personal details that make wishes matter. A steering committee formed, composed of parents, pilots, hospital social workers, and a representative who had been in Justin's doorway that day. They called it the Paper Plane Fund, taking the image from the pin he had given Maya and the way small things can travel far. News of the fund's early work traveled slow and careful. There were human interest pieces that focused not on spectacle, but on the things that made a wish a wish. The humility of volunteers, the quiet of pilots who ferried small dreams, the grateful families who received an hour of wonder. Social media, when used gently, became a channel for coordination rather than voyeurism. Lists of needed items, requests for help, and the sharing of small reconstructed moments. Photos of a child with flour on their cheeks after a baking day, a shaky video of a private songwriter teaching a lullaby, an image of a pilot handing over a wing-shaped pen. Over the months, the Paper Plane Fund helped arrange dozens of wishes. The scale was never huge, but the intimacy was exact. A backyard camping night for a boy who loved stars, a private studio tour for a teen who loved drums, a ferry ride for a child who wanted to see the ocean at dawn. Each wish was granted with the same care as Maya's had been. No press, consent guided by families, and an emphasis on things that felt like a life rather than a headline. Justin's role, when present, remained personal. He made a few quiet appearances, seeded funds, and used his platform to amplify vetted, compassionate organizations that could do the delicate work of granting final, meaningful experiences. People noticed the ripple. Local communities started fundraising on their own. A civic group in a small town commissioned a memorial bench engraved with a paper plane. A church choir organized a charity night. High school groups volunteered time to build sensory gardens at hospitals. The action spread like a pattern sewn into fabric. Small, visible stitches that held a larger piece together. Not everyone would write a check. Some made sandwiches. Some drove vans. And some simply sat with a child who needed a hand to hold. The patchwork of work carried its own quiet fame. There were donors who requested anonymity, pilots who refused interviews, and volunteers who preferred to keep their names out of the news. The initiative's public face was intentionally low-key, a website with clear guidelines, a transparent list of verified partners, and a promise that the wishes would be crafted with family dignity and patient comfort in mind. The Paper Plane Fund's charter emphasized private partnership, consent, and the primacy of family wishes. It deliberately avoided spectacle. In the weeks that followed, Claire found herself receiving letters and messages from people who had been touched by Maya's story. Some were long and candid. A grandmother who recalled watching a child watch a plane and think of possibilities. A high school student who said he had organized a bake sale in Maya's name. A parent who had lost a child months before and wrote only to say, "Thank you." The correspondence read like a map of ordinary grief and ordinary response, people wanting to do something that mattered. As the first anniversary of Maya's flight approached, the community planned a small commemoration. They planted a tree near the hospital's outpatient garden and affixed a plaque that read simply, "For moments of brave light." Claire placed Maya's rabbit on the bench for the photo, its missing ear patched with a scrap of blue cloth. The plaque had a small, tasteful reference to the Paper Plane Fund, noting that it was a private effort inspired by a child's wish. There was an on-screen card in the fund's public materials stating that certain dramatized elements in media retellings were meant to protect privacy, and that verifiable donors and partnerships were documented on their site. Someone took a photograph that evening of a small, single-engine plane crossing a sky touched by sun just as it sank, the plane's red belly a tiny, defiant slash of color. The image became a simple emblem, a symbol of one brief rise above ordinary life. The photograph was shared carefully, not with the intention of celebrity, but as a reminder that certain joys can be carved out no matter how brief. The legacy, if that is what you call a pattern of small acts, was not a monument of stone, but a living network. The Paper Plane Fund remained intentionally modest in structure. It connected families to vetted volunteers. It fundraised in community kitchens and quiet online pages. It kept the promises small and personally focused. And it insisted on one rule above all. Wishes were always granted with dignity and consent, and never for spectacle. Justin, who had once sat in a small hospital room and listened, continued to show up in private ways. He sent handwritten notes and occasional funds, and he advocated publicly for verified charities that shared the fund's principles: privacy, family-centered planning, and a refusal to commodify grief. To be clear, the precise amounts he pledged and the legal structure of any particular donation were handled behind the scenes and presented publicly only in verified statements. Production notes for any media depiction recommend a verification step before listing names, amounts, or organizational leadership. The story that began with a simple post became something else entirely. Not a star's grand gesture, but a communal lesson. People learned to ask for what was human: an hour of flight, the smell of wind on a face, the sound of laughter unmediated by applause. They learned that a celebrity is a person who can choose to listen, and that listening, when done well, has a power all its own. Years later, the bench remained under the tree. Children played in the garden. Pilots, some with gray in their hair now, still volunteered taxi flights for the fund. The paper plane pin, which had been given to Maya in a dim hospital room, was manufactured in small batches and offered quietly to families as a keepsake. It was never a logo for a brand. It was a talisman for a time when a wish had been heard and granted. Claire kept the small scrap of paper that had been folded into Maya's scrapbook. The note that read simply, "For Maya, who taught me how to keep trying." She read it when grief felt close, and she passed the rabbit to neighbors who needed a reminder that tenderness still existed. The final image of this story is small and private: a red plane crossing a late sky, a single light moving toward horizon. It is an image that refuses to be simplified into a headline. It asks instead for a quieter response: to be present, to say yes to the impossible smallness of someone's wish, and to understand that sometimes the most meaningful monuments are the actions we take in the pause between breath and memory. The final image of this story is small and private: a red plane crossing a late sky, a single light moving toward horizon. It is an image that refuses to be simplified into a headline. It asks instead for a quieter response: to be present, to say yes to the impossible smallness of someone's wish, and to understand that sometimes the most meaningful monuments are the actions we take in the pause between breath and memory. This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by real human interest events. Certain personal details and private actions have been fictionalized for narrative clarity. Any references to private donations, funds, or pledges are presented as part of the dramatized story. Verify specific philanthropic claims through official channels listed in the description. If this story moved you, find verified Children's Wish charities linked in the description. There, you'll see organizations that specialize in granting private, family-centered wishes, and you can learn how to support them safely and respectfully. In the end, it was not the celebrity's name that made the memory stick. It was the way a small request turned a community toward compassion, the way strangers folded their time and talents into a single deliberate kindness. It was a reminder that a child's brief wish can be a bell that calls people to be tender, not spectacle, to act, not announce. The red plane kept flying. The bench under the tree kept welcoming tired feet. And when the wind moved through the garden, people said a little prayer, if prayers are what you offer, or simply smiled, because for a moment a child had been given a sky. Please subscribe to hear more stories like this, and check the description to learn how to support verified programs that grant last wishes to children and families in need.